Hello everyone, welcome to The Old History, The Edge of the World, a historical fiction story of the first discovery of America. The Whisper of the West. In the quiet ports of Portugal and Spain during the late 15th century, rumors began to swirl among sailors and mapmakers of a land far across the Western Sea, untouched by known empires, unmarked on charts, and cloaked in myth. Among those who listened intently was a Genoese navigator named Christopher Columbus to the Spanish, who became obsessed with the idea that one could reach the riches of the East by sailing west. The monarch's gamble. After years of rejection from courts across Europe, Columbus finally stood before Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand of Spain. Though skeptical, the monarchs, desperate to outpace Portugal in exploration and trade, granted Columbus ships, supplies, and a royal commission. Less out of conviction than a gamble to change Spain's fortune. Into the unknown. On August 3, 1492, Columbus set sail from Palos de la Frontera with 3 ships, the Niña, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. As weeks dragged into months and food supplies dwindled, mutiny brewed among the men. But on the morning of October 12th, a cry rang out from the Pinta. Tierra! Land had been sighted. A new world unveiled. Columbus stepped onto an island in the Bahamas, believing it was part of Asia. He was greeted by the Lucayan Taino people, whose kindness and gold jewelry convinced him he'd reached the outskirts of the Indies. He named the island San Salvador and claimed it for Spain, unaware he was standing on a continent unknown to the Old World. Across the islands. In the following weeks, Columbus explored the Caribbean, sailing to Cuba and Hispaniola. He marveled at the lush landscapes and began constructing a small settlement, La Navidad. Though the Taino welcomed them, misunderstandings and greed led to tension. Columbus saw the natives as potential converts and laborers, setting the stage for future conquest. Return and revelation. Columbus returned to Spain in 1493 with tales of vast lands and samples of gold, parrots, and a few captured islanders. He was hailed a hero, admiral of the ocean sea. Europe buzzed with excitement over the supposed discovery of a western route to Asia, though some scholars and explorers remained skeptical. The seeds of empire. The Spanish crown quickly funded a second voyage, this time with 17 ships and over 1,000 men. But this journey marked the beginning of colonization. When Columbus returned to La Navidad, he found it destroyed. In its place, he founded Isabella, the Forgotten Footsteps. Unbeknownst to Columbus, others had already glimpsed the continent. Norse explorers like Leif Erikson had landed in what is now Newfoundland around 500 years earlier, calling it Vinland. But without lasting contact or written records preserved in Europe, their voyages had faded into legend, leaving Columbus's journey to define the discovery in the European consciousness. The fall of illusion. By Columbus's third and fourth voyages, his illusions of finding Asia began to unravel. Harsh conditions, rebellion among his men, and resistance from indigenous people weakened his authority. He was eventually arrested and returned to Spain in chains, his reputation tarnished, though his name would echo through history. The true discovery. It was Italian explorer Amerigo Vespucci who realized the lands were not Asia but an entirely new continent. In his letters, he described the vast coastlines and cultures he encountered, and in 1507, a German cartographer named Martin Waldseemüller named the continent America in his honor, forever changing the way the world viewed the Western lands. A world transformed. The discovery of the Americas unleashed an age of exploration, conquest, and tragedy. European powers scrambled to claim territory, spreading disease, religion, and war across continents. While the Old World gained wealth and power, the indigenous civilizations of the New World faced devastation and transformation beyond comprehension. Echoes of the first step. Centuries later, the legacy of that first voyage still shapes the modern world. Though celebrated by some as heroic exploration, it is remembered by others as the beginning of colonization and suffering. The story of the first discovery of America is not just one of courage. It is a story of complexity, contradiction, and the collision of worlds. The Papal Divide. As Spain and Portugal clashed over new territorial claims, Pope Alexander VI issued the Inter Caetera in 1493, granting Spain exclusive rights to lands west of a demarcation line. The following year, the Treaty of Tordesillas was signed, shifting the line slightly and giving Portugal claim to what would later become Brazil, setting the stage for centuries of colonial rivalry. The Spanish Return. With Columbus out of favor, Spain turned to new leaders like Hernán Cortés and Francisco Pizarro, who would carve bloody paths into the hearts of powerful empires. But before them, lesser-known explorers sailed from the Spanish ports, some seeking gold, others fleeing poverty, each contributing to the slow mapping of the New World's edge. The Taíno Tragedy. The Taíno population, once vibrant and welcoming, suffered immensely under Spanish rule. Forced labor, violence, and old-world diseases like smallpox decimated communities. The rise of Cortés. In 1519, Hernán Cortés landed on the Yucatan Peninsula, driven by tales of vast inland wealth. With a small army and native allies, he marched toward the Aztec capital, Tenochtitlan. The Spanish brought horses, steel, and guns, unfamiliar to the Mexica, and began one of history's most brutal and consequential conquests. The fall of an empire. Cortés met Emperor Montezuma II under a veil of ceremony and suspicion. Tensions grew, rebellions sparked, and within 2 years, the mighty Aztec Empire crumbled under siege, betrayal, and disease. Spain now possessed a vast new territory, New Spain, and the floodgates of conquest opened wide. The Forgotten Navigator. While fame fell on Columbus, others ventured north. John Cabot, an Italian sailing for England, reached Newfoundland in 1497, claiming parts of the east coast for the English crown. Though his journey was brief, it laid the foundation for future English settlements, centuries before Jamestown or Plymouth. The Mapmaker's Triumph. By the early 1500s, European cartographers began piecing together the New World's shape. South America's curves and river systems appeared on maps, while North America remained a mystery. Sea monsters and mythical cities like El Dorado were inked beside real coastlines, blurring fantasy and fact for eager explorers. The spirit of resistance. Not all native tribes submitted. The Caribs, Apaches, and many others fiercely defended their homelands. Guerrilla tactics, shifting alliances, and knowledge of terrain helped them resist European control for decades. Though many were defeated, their stories of resistance echoed long after their lands were taken. The Lost Colony. In 1587, the English attempted a permanent colony on Roanoke Island in present-day North Carolina. Led by John White, the settlement mysteriously vanished by the time he returned from England. Only the word Croatoan carved into a post remained, leaving a mystery that has never been solved. The Age of Myths and Maps. As reports from the Americas reached Europe, myths flourished, fountains of youth, cities of gold, and tribes of women warriors. These tales drove many to risk the treacherous Atlantic crossing, hoping for glory. But most found only hardship, hunger, and hostile lands, shaped not by fantasy, but survival. The Empire in the Andes. Far to the south, the Inca Empire ruled a vast network of cities and roads across the Andes Mountains. In 1532, Francisco Pizarro arrived with a small band of Spaniards and captured the Inca Emperor Atahualpa during a fateful meeting in Cajamarca. Promising release for a room filled with gold, Portugal's quiet invasion. While Spain conquered the West, Portugal quietly established itself in the east of South America. In 1500, Pedro Álvares Cabral landed on Brazil's coast, claiming it for Portugal under the Treaty of Tordesillas. Over the following decades, the Portuguese established sugar plantations and enslaved indigenous Brazilians, later turning to enslaved Africans when native populations declined. The search for El Dorado. Driven by rumors of a golden city hidden in the jungles of South America, Spanish conquistadors like Francisco de Orellana ventured deep into the Amazon. They found no such city, but their expeditions charted rivers, encountered countless tribes, and left a trail of destruction. The myth of El Dorado persisted for centuries, luring explorers to their deaths. The French arrive. By the 16th century, France began to challenge Spanish and Portuguese dominance. Explorers like Jacques Cartier sailed up the St. Lawrence River, establishing claims to what would become New France. In contrast to the Spanish, many French trappers and missionaries built alliances with indigenous tribes, especially in the fur trade, forming complex, often fragile relationships. The Dutch ambitions. The Dutch, rising as a maritime power, founded New Netherland in the early 1600s with the settlement of New Amsterdam, modern-day New York. Their focus on trade rather than conquest created a diverse, commercially driven colony. However, tension with native tribes and English rivals would eventually doom their colonial ambitions in North America. The Spanish mission system. To strengthen control and convert indigenous populations, the Spanish built a vast network of missions stretching from present-day Mexico into California. Franciscan friars preached Christianity, taught European agriculture, and suppressed native religions. While some natives converted willingly, many others resisted or fled, sparking revolts like the Pueblo Rebellion of 1680. Disease and collapse. Perhaps the most devastating consequence of the Columbian exchange was disease. Smallpox, measles, and influenza decimated native populations who had no immunity. In many regions, over 80% of the population died within decades. Entire societies were erased, not by war, but by invisible invaders that swept through the land faster than any army. There were fewer than 100 of them left, starving, wounded, and armed with little more than their rifles and a grim resolve. The commander, a man whose own arm was bound in a blood-soaked rag, gathered them in the dark of a shattered cave. There would be no more retreating, no more hiding. The final order was given. A banzai charge. It was not a tactic for victory, but a ritual for an honorable death. Kenji tightened the grip on his rifle, the bayonet gleaming faintly. He thought not of glory, but of his mother's face. As they screamed and ran into the blinding glare of enemy machine guns, the struggle was no longer against the foe, but against the primal, desperate instinct to live, an instinct they had been ordered to sacrifice on the altar of duty. Kenji, a miraculous and cursed survivor of the charge, found himself on Okinawa, a veteran ghost in a boy's body. The fighting had gone underground, a troglodyte war in a honeycomb of caves and tunnels. The air was foul with the smell of cordite, blood, and unwashed bodies, and the darkness was absolute, broken only by the terrifying roar of a flamethrower searing the life out of a nearby tunnel entrance. Here, the struggle was against claustrophobia, against a thirst so profound it felt like swallowing dust, and against the creeping insanity that came from living in a tomb. The enemy was no longer a distant figure, but a shadow in the dark, and every fight was a desperate, intimate brawl for a few more feet of suffocating earth. He was captured in a daze, too weak from starvation and wounds to resist. Then came the day the war ended, not with a final cataclysmic battle, but with a crackling voice from a radio. The Emperor, the living god for whom millions had died, spoke with the voice of a mortal man, announcing surrender. For Kenji, the silence that followed the broadcast was more deafening than any explosion. The entire foundation of his world, honor, sacrifice, divine victory, crumbled into dust. The greatest struggle now was against the shame of having to survive. He was a prisoner, alive while his comrades were honorable dead. The war had been lost, and the purpose for which he had endured hell had vanished, leaving only a vast, empty void. African chains. With native labor dwindling and European economies demanding more sugar, gold, and silver, colonizers turned to Africa. The transatlantic slave trade began in earnest, and millions of Africans were captured, shackled, and shipped across the ocean to toil on plantations. Their suffering, endurance, and culture would forever shape the Americas. The rise of the English colonies. The English, late to colonization, founded Jamestown in 1607 and Plymouth in 1620. While Jamestown struggled with starvation and conflict, the Pilgrims of Plymouth sought religious freedom. These early settlements laid the groundwork for a colonial culture that would eventually challenge European kings and redefine the meaning of America. The clash of worlds. By the 17th century, the Americas had become a vast arena of competing empires, tribal nations, and enslaved peoples. European powers carved out territories, indigenous nations resisted or negotiated their survival, and millions of Africans lived and died in bondage. The New World was no longer a blank map. It was a battleground of ambition, faith, freedom, and conquest.